Welcome to Global Nexus. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon for more breaking updates. In the spring of 2019, a wave of anxiety swept across the golden prairies of Western Canada. The land, usually alive with the promise of a new season, felt different this year. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something was about to change. For generations, these fields had been a source of pride and prosperity, but now, uncertainty loomed on the horizon. Farmers, whose livelihoods depended on canola, watched nervously as rumors spread of shipments being rejected at Chinese ports. The news traveled quickly, carried by word of mouth, radio, and the ever-present hum of social media. Each new report brought fresh worry as families wondered what the future would hold if their harvests could not find a market. Their fields, once symbols of prosperity and hope, now represented uncertainty and risk. The bright yellow blossoms, usually a sign of abundance, seemed to fade under the weight of doubt. Every gust of wind across the prairie carried with it questions that no one could answer. China, their biggest customer and a vital trading partner, was suddenly imposing strict new inspection standards. Containers that once moved freely were now held up for scrutiny, their contents examined and questioned. The rules had changed overnight, and no one knew how long the uncertainty would last. The cause? A diplomatic crisis, sparked by the arrest of a Chinese tech executive in Vancouver months earlier. What began as a single event in a distant city had rippled outward, touching the lives of thousands of farmers who had no part in the dispute. The headlines were global, but the consequences were deeply personal. What began as a distant legal drama was now threatening the economic lifeblood of entire communities. In small towns across the prairies, local businesses braced for the impact, knowing that a bad year for farmers meant hardship for everyone. Coffee shop conversations turned somber, and community meetings filled with worry and frustration. Farmers felt powerless, their fate tied to a geopolitical standoff far beyond their control. They scrolled through news updates, searching for answers, but found only more questions. The sense of isolation grew, as the vastness of the prairie seemed to mirror the uncertainty of the times. The promise of the harvest was clouded by doubt. Equipment sat idle, and hands that once worked with confidence now hesitated. The rhythm of the season was disrupted, replaced by a waiting game with no clear end in sight. The outcome would not be decided by weather or hard work, but by a high-stakes conflict between global powers. Trade negotiations and diplomatic meetings, far removed from the fields, would determine the fate of the harvest and the future of rural communities. Their canola fields had become collateral damage in a battle they never chose. As the storm gathered on the horizon, prairie farmers faced a season unlike any they had ever known, hoping that resilience and unity would see them through the uncertainty ahead. On December 1, 2018, Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei and the daughter of the company's powerful founder, was detained at Vancouver International Airport. The arrest was sudden and unexpected, sending shockwaves through the global business and diplomatic communities. As Meng stepped off her flight, Canadian authorities moved in, acting on a secretive U.S. extradition request that had been quietly coordinated behind the scenes. Canadian officials, caught between their obligations to international law and the looming influence of their southern neighbor, found themselves at the center of a geopolitical storm. The U.S. accused Meng of violating sanctions against Iran, and Canada was now thrust into the crossfire between two of the world's most powerful nations. The arrest quickly escalated into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. China viewed the move as a direct political attack on one of its most prominent companies, while the United States insisted it was simply a matter of enforcing the law. International headlines blared, and the world's attention turned to Vancouver. After a tense court hearing, Meng was granted bail, but her freedom was strictly limited. She was confined to her luxurious Vancouver home, monitored around the clock by security and electronic surveillance, her every move scrutinized by both Canadian authorities and the global media. For Meng, this marked the beginning of a long and uncertain legal battle, one that would drag on for years. For Canada, it was the start of a diplomatic nightmare, as the country struggled to balance its legal responsibilities with mounting pressure from both Washington and Beijing. In Beijing, outrage was immediate and intense. The Chinese government condemned the arrest, insisting it was politically motivated and warning that there would be consequences for Canada's actions. Chinese officials demanded Meng's immediate release, issuing stern warnings and rallying public support. Protests erupted, and the diplomatic standoff deepened, with both sides refusing to back down. The world watched as what began as a legal process in a Canadian courtroom quickly spiraled into a global spectacle, with journalists and observers from every continent following every twist and turn. The storm had broken, and at its very center stood Canada, caught in a crisis that would test its diplomacy, its legal system, and its place on the world stage. The US accused Meng of fraud, alleging she misled banks about Huawei's ties to Skycom Tech, a company secretly controlled by Huawei and doing business in Iran. This deception, the US claimed, put banks at risk of violating American sanctions. The case was built on a PowerPoint Meng presented to HSBC, allegedly concealing the true relationship. But the charges were about more than bank fraud. They were part of a broader US campaign to curb Huawei's global influence and counter China's tech ambitions. The extradition request forced Canada to weigh complex legal and geopolitical stakes. China's response was swift and severe. Days after Meng's arrest, two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, were detained in China, accused of espionage. Their detention, widely seen as retaliation, contrasted sharply with Meng's house arrest. The two Michaels endured harsh conditions, while Meng lived in comfort. China's message was clear: for every move against Meng, Canadians would pay a price. The crisis put immense pressure on Canada, caught between upholding the rule of law and securing its citizens' freedom. Hostage diplomacy had become a grim reality. In March 2019, China escalated its retaliation, blocking Canadian canola imports under the pretext of contamination. For prairie farmers, this was devastating. China bought 40% of their canola. The ban was widely seen as political punishment, not a technical issue. Prices crashed. Surpluses piled up, and farmers faced financial ruin. The Canadian government scrambled to offer aid and find new markets, but none could replace China's demand. The crisis rippled through rural communities, threatening livelihoods far beyond the fields. The canola ban exposed Canada's vulnerability to geopolitical shocks. Trade had become a weapon, and farmers paid the price. The Meng affair became a symbol of the 21st century's tangled web of technology, trade, and trust. At its heart was the US-China rivalry over tech supremacy, with Huawei at the center. The US pressured allies to ban Huawei from 5G networks, citing security risks, while China offered economic incentives. Countries like Canada were forced to choose sides in a tech Cold War. The canola ban shattered the belief that trade would guarantee peace. China showed it was willing to weaponize its market power to punish political dissent. The crisis exposed a fundamental clash of values: rule of law versus state power. For Canada, defending legal principles came at a steep economic and human cost. Trust in the global trading system was deeply shaken. After nearly 3 years of tense negotiations, legal maneuvering, and mounting international pressure, a deal was finally struck. Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive at the center of a global standoff, admitted to misleading banks about the company's business dealings in Iran. This admission was a carefully crafted statement, one that allowed both sides to claim a measure of victory, while sidestepping a full trial that could have further inflamed tensions. In exchange, the US Department of Justice agreed to drop the charges against her, provided she complied with the terms of the agreement. The resolution was delicate, balancing legal accountability with the urgent need to de-escalate a diplomatic crisis that had drawn in 3 nations. Meng was freed and allowed to return to China, where she was greeted as a national hero. Her release was broadcast live, symbolizing a rare moment of triumph for Beijing in a high-stakes international dispute. Almost simultaneously, the two Michaels, Kovrig and Spavor, were released from Chinese prison and flown home to Canada. Their return was met with relief and celebration, but also with lingering questions about the price paid for their freedom. The near-simultaneous exchange made clear the undeniable link between the cases. For many, it was a stark example of hostage diplomacy in action, a strategy that, in this instance, had achieved its intended effect. Relief, however, was tempered by the realization that the damage was lasting. Trust between Canada and China had been deeply fractured, and the diplomatic chill would not thaw easily. In Canada, public opinion toward China soured dramatically. Politicians and citizens alike called for a more cautious, even skeptical approach to future relations. The episode became a turning point in Canada's foreign policy, prompting a reassessment of how to engage with authoritarian powers. The crisis exposed the precarious position of middle powers like Canada, caught between the competing interests of global giants. It was a sobering lesson in the risks and vulnerabilities that come with navigating a world shaped by great power rivalry. Even after China eventually lifted its ban on Canadian canola, the memory of economic retaliation lingered. Canadian exporters and officials realized the trade could be weaponized at any moment. In response, Canada began to diversify its trade relationships, seeking new markets and partners to reduce its dependence on any single country. The experience became a catalyst for a broader rethinking of economic strategy. Meanwhile, the global tech war raged on, with Huawei remaining at the center of controversy. The company's role in next-generation networks continued to draw scrutiny from Western governments. Security concerns and allegations of espionage kept Huawei under a cloud of suspicion, highlighting the intersection of technology, security, and geopolitics. The Meng affair ultimately revealed the deep fault lines running through the new global order. It was a case study in how legal systems, diplomacy, and economic interests collide on the world stage. In today's interconnected world, a single arrest can set off a chain reaction, upending justice, technology, and trade, with consequences that echo for years and reshape the global landscape in ways no one can fully predict.